Thank you for being here. We have a very interesting discussion to get going on because there's a lot to cover, and we value the time of our guests, both of whom are very certified experts on this issue of Section 230 of the Communications Act of 1996, I believe. Essential equipment.
Mind me. Yeah, this is.
It's fine. So our guests are Monica Bickert from Meta, formerly known as Facebook, has held several key positions there, and I think in charge of global policy there now, if I'm not mistaken. And Eric Goldman, professor of law at Santa Clara University Law School, I gather really nearby, and a well-recognized, esteemed expert on the issue of Section 230 and potential internet regulation or not, and someone who is widely cited on these issues. So Eric helpfully pointed out to me a few days ago that we were assuming everybody knew what Section 230 is and why it's important and what it does. And I think I know. I think I have an East Coast knowledge of Section 230, but instead I'm going to ask both Eric and Monica to tell all of us what do they think Section 230 is, what does it accomplish, and why is it important to them? Eric, you want to go first?
Yeah, working. Hi, everybody. And I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to the Georgetown Free Speech Project. Thank you to the Knight Foundation. Thank you to San Jose State for putting this conversation together. Section 230 is so important that I'm always glad when we have a chance to celebrate it because it's this unsung hero in the background. Many people may not know what it is doing and don't appreciate how many times they interact with it every day. But you're sure glad you have it, and we'll explain why. Section 230 is a statute that Congress enacted in 1996, and it says, and I'm just going to summarize in lay speak, it says websites aren't liable for third-party content. And stated simply like that, it's actually quite intuitive. When we think about the ability to publish content online, we as users are given tools that let us express ourselves and reach audiences. And so when we're given those tools, the idea is that whoever is choosing to speak, like a user who's posting content online, is responsible for the words that they communicate. But that the service enabling them to speak, that gives them the tools to speak, is not. And it's that simple, elegant principle that authors are responsible for their words, but these intermediate tools offering the ability to reach an audience are not, that actually is like quite intuitive. And there's been empirical studies of this question that say that when people are asked the question, who should be responsible for content online? The answer is authors should be responsible, not services. And so that's what Section 230 does. Section 230 is the foundation of the modern internet. It's why we are able to talk to each other online the way that we all do. Some of you are probably doing that right now. You're benefiting from Section 230 orally as we talk and online as you multitask. And the services that benefit from it are some of the largest, most well-known internet services that you use many times a day, often many times an hour. And so Section 230 reaches very deeply into our daily lives by enabling us to use the services that we enjoy most online and to be able then to be able to accomplish our personal goals and our professional goals using these tools. So that's what it says, and I think also that might be an answer why I think it's so important. But let me turn it over to Monica.
Monica, what is your view of Section 230?
I would echo everything that Professor Goldman said, and also point out that services, when people think about Section 230, they often just think about the traditional social media apps. But what they don't think about are all the other services we use that are interactive computer services you're going on and you're reading, you're going to go out to dinner. And so you're reading restaurant reviews. You're on a news site and there's an article and there's a bunch of comments underneath the article where people can interact with one another. You're on Amazon and you're looking at products and you want to see what everybody has to say about them. Well, there's two things about that. One is you really want those services to exist, and they wouldn't exist if the protections of Section 230 had not been in place. If you look back at the cases that were coming to court before Section 230, you had emerging internet companies that were trying to figure out, hey, are we allowed to monitor this stuff? If we have rules and we say we're going to start removing content, does that maybe mean that we're responsible for the stuff that we didn't remove? And they had good reason, based on what was happening in the courts, to be fearful of that. And so these things that we use every day to make our lives better would not have been able to develop like that. But the other part of Section 230 that's really important for companies like Meta is that it gives us a shield. We are allowed to, or I guess this is the sword part, it's the sword and the shield. It gives us the ability to go out and moderate content that if we didn't have that protection, we would be afraid to do that. So if you look at the big social media sites, I already mentioned some, but Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, all of these apps have rules that, for instance, prohibit terror propaganda, or in some cases, adult nudity, or making threats, or bullying people. Those companies wouldn't be able to go out and moderate that content and enforce those rules without knowing that they might be sued for the content that they did not moderate if they didn't have Section 230 protections. That's important because the bulk of what we do, and we're going to probably get into this later, but the bulk of what we do as social media companies, the bulk of the content that we remove is based on our own policies, not on government requests. And so if you didn't have Section 230 that allowed companies to act on all this content, you would be looking at a very different internet. I used the internet when it was, in its earliest stages. I remember being in chat rooms online, and it was a very different experience than you're going to have when you're using most sites today. And that's in large part because Section 230 has allowed all this to develop the way it has.
So Section 230 was passed in 1996, and I'm interested in knowing more about what judges call the legislative history of it was. Who proposed it? Why? Was there some specific harm that was taking place that needed to be fixed by passing Section 230? How did it come about? Was it unanimously passed? Were there reservations about it? Just quickly, some of those typical questions.
There were two primary cases that came out that motivated Section 230, and both of them held essentially that websites could be liable for third-party content if they had the requisite knowledge about a problem on the site. Now, the exact level of knowledge was still being developed. And the second of the two cases was especially chilling because it said, as Monica was suggesting, that there could be liability simply by trying to moderate content. If you didn't perfectly moderate all content, whatever you missed, you'd be liable for. And so it was just basic principle. Is it better to try and fail or to not try at all? And the two legal cases that were before Section 230 seemed to set up a no-win situation. Either you try and fail with potentially business-ending liability, or you don't try at all, and then anarchy ensues. If you're not trying to clean up the content on the site, as Monica indicated, you're going to have an experience that's going to be filled with content that makes people uncomfortable and ultimately to leave. Now, Section 230 was companioned with another law that was called the Communications Decency Act. And the Communications Decency Act was Congress's first effort to try to regulate content online. The Communications Decency Act basically said that websites were obligated to keep children from accessing material that was appropriate only for adults. Now, I'm oversimplifying. The devil is in the details in a situation like that. And what happened is that some entrepreneuring legislators thought we really need to make sure that services will feel the freedom to decide how best to manage the content for their audiences. And they're not going to do so if they're liable for trying and failing. They'll do too little content moderation. So we're going to propose this bill as a way of encouraging voluntarily services to protect children from adult content because they are going to have the legal freedom to do so. So on the one hand, Congress enacted a law that basically criminalized the availability of adult material for children online, and at the same time created a legal system that was incentives for services to do more to voluntarily police content to keep it away from children. They were intended to be alternative proposals, and what happened is Congress, instead of picking, put them together and said, we won't decide, we'll let both go forward. Which is a weird way of legislation making, but it gets to your question like, was it unanimous? Well, both were actually well supported, but they were always intended to be alternatives for each other, and so it's a little complicated to read the tea leaves of the vote.
But there were no votes against it at all?
I don't remember, a small handful of votes. Yeah, there were a small number of people who objected for whatever reason. That ultimately is not important to the fate. But because they all were alternatives, it's a little bit confusing to understand the history because you're like, those two bills don't go together. You cannot do both simultaneously. And yes, that's what Congress did. That's when they were less dysfunctional than they are today. So we're actually going to call that a win. The reason why we don't talk about the Communications Decency Act, the other provision that was passed alongside Section 230, is because the court struck that down as unconstitutional. So what happened is Congress passed two different proposals. One with Section 230 remains on the books today. The other struck down as unconstitutional. So the courts picked which one was the right proposal over Congress.
And did anything change immediately when Section 230 was passed? Did Facebook begin behaving differently in some fashion?
Well, so Facebook didn't exist at that point.
Okay.
But Section 230 is what allowed companies like Facebook to develop. Sorry, I'm like caught up with this on my earring. Also, apologies for the whole like kind of bizarre setup here. I'm still getting over something. But you know, one thing that I think is interesting is if you look at the text of Section 230, it doesn't just talk about giving companies the ability to moderate illegal content. It basically says you can moderate content maybe because of a risk, but also maybe because it's otherwise objectionable. And when you think about the way that we all use services today, if you are on LinkedIn or you are reading reviews of restaurants, there are good reasons why those companies, why those apps might say, look, if you're writing content on the restaurant review site and it's not about a restaurant review, we're just not going to allow it. Now, that doesn't mean that what you were going to write was harmful or unsafe, but there are reasons why these apps have been able to develop in ways that are wonderful, in the ways that we use them, because they were able to moderate content that way.
I'm sorry, Stan, can I just piggyback
Yes, go
quickly? You asked the question, what happened immediately after Section 230?
Was there a big party?
No, actually. And this is actually something that, because so few people were around paying attention then, people would have assumed like there was a whole bunch of internet companies that were just partying in the streets after having gone this. Well, first of all, there weren't that many big internet companies at the time. There were players like Yahoo that you've heard of. eBay had just been born, but Facebook didn't exist. Google did not exist. And so like these smaller companies, or today relatively small, didn't really know what they got. But what they knew is that the other half of the Communications Decency Act, the thing that criminalized the liability for, imposing liability for allowing minors to access adult materials, was hugely chilling. So actually, when the Communications Decency Act was enacted, the industry was in panic. And it was only when two things happened in 1997. The Supreme Court struck down the criminalization component, and a Fourth Circuit opinion out of the East Coast interpreted Section 230 to say if a service is trying to moderate content, that is a reason to give them Section 230 protection. And as a result, it was the combination of the strike down of the criminal provision and this Fourth Circuit interpretation that answered some questions to help people understand how to apply it. When people saw that opinion, they realized that Congress had done something really significant. Until then, they were far more fearful of the criminal provision.
So the period of time until the industry recognized what it had was what, a year or two?
Yeah, roughly 18 months when the Supreme Court opinion struck down
Right.
that part of the provision was actually struck down by the lowest court within a week. So there was some hope that that provision was never going to be effective, but you never know until it got to the Supreme Court. Everyone knew it was going there.
Of course.
But the interpretation of Section 230 from the Fourth Circuit opinion, people just were like, they knew something had been passed, but nobody was really quite sure what it meant. And that's when the light bulbs went off. And that's really when we saw the turbocharging of new services that said, we can actually use this to our benefit to build services that help people talk to each other and not
Right.
fear the liability. Congress actually enabled us to do that.
So earlier today, on this same stage, we heard the story of a Third Circuit decision that just came down very recently. You, perhaps both of you, know about it. Eric, you're shaking your head. You mean about a young
This
girl?
is the Anderson versus TikTok case.
A young girl, I think 11 years old, who actually killed herself on the basis of, I haven't read the opinion myself, so I'm describing it on the basis of hearing someone else describe it earlier today. But after reading on the internet, on TikTok, I think in particular, if I'm not mistaken, how to choke herself, and how to learn and teach her friends, and she died. Her parents sued, and it sounds like the Third Circuit ruled against Section 230 in a fashion in this case. Are you familiar with it enough?
If you don't mind, let me just supplement your remarks a bit. Just because I've covered so many Section 230 cases in my life, I'm not inured to the tragedy, but I just accept that every Section 230 case has some tragedy behind it. There's someone who is hurt or harmed who believes that they are not going to be able to obtain justice without being able to sue the internet services. So, this is a Section 230 tragedy, but not a unique tragedy. That's the way Section 230 cases go. And the case involved what's called the blackout challenge that was making its rounds on TikTok. The blackout challenge predates TikTok. It predates the internet. People have done pranks and stupid things well before the internet educated them on how to do that. But it's still a tragedy. We have a girl who committed suicide, essentially, by trying to replicate this blackout challenge that she saw on TikTok. The problem is that there's not a lot of ways for TikTok to address this problem without completely restructuring how it works, in which case it may not be TikTok anymore. It becomes a different service,
Right.
maybe a lot less helpful to everyone else.
A lot of people would be very happy with that in the case of TikTok.
I mean, to be clear, as many of you may know, but some of you probably don't, Congress has already banned TikTok in the U.S. That battle is being fought in the courts as well, but your legislatures have voted to eliminate TikTok from the United States. So,
not for this reason, but for an alleged national security threat.
I mean, there are allegations, but the bottom line is that the point is, literally, our legislators are working to take tools out of our hands. So there is a group of people who think it would be swell if TikTok did not exist. And if Section 230 isn't available for TikTok, no big loss, because TikTok should not exist anyway. I do not subscribe to that view. I'm guessing you don't either, but you need not commit to it. That it should not be in the hands of legislatures to take away speech venues from us where we're talking to each other and decide that that's an appropriate way for controlling conversations. And similarly, when Section 230 is unavailable for TikTok, TikTok can't do the things that you actually use it for. What is TikTok best at? They're best at surfacing content that is designed to meet your particular interests. And what the court said is that if that's what TikTok's doing, they're not eligible for Section 230. So if that's the case, what is TikTok at that point? Do they become like a Google Drive where all they can do is host content, then everyone else has to go and promote or find that content without any assistance from the immediate service? That is a service, it's just not TikTok. And I'm guessing if the internet were just Google Drive links and nothing else, you probably wouldn't find it nearly as interesting as it is today.
So, Monica, how do you, you're a mother, your children are presumably susceptible to things online. Maybe they're too old to be susceptible now, but might have been at some point. Do you know, what about these? There are no doubt quite a few personal tragedies, as Eric suggests, that some people are attributing to the laxity of the rules governing the internet.
I think that one thing people often misunderstand is the difference between having a policy line and being able to enforce that line perfectly. We see a lot of stories in the news media about, this content was up on this site and that could be really horrible for a young person to see, or this content was up on that app and that would be horrible for anyone to see. If you look at those sites' rules, I think you're going to find that for the big sites and for even the medium ones, really, as apps grow, they start to build the ability to moderate content and they start building policies. But when you look at any of these established sites, they will have policies that say, we don't allow content that promotes suicide. We don't allow content that shows you how to engage in dangerous challenges. We don't allow beheading videos, terror propaganda, death threats, hate speech, rape videos. They don't allow that content. But the trick is, there is no magical switch that you can flip. By the way, let me back up and say, a lot of that content is actually lawful. So we're not talking about illegal speech. We are talking about speech that these apps don't want on their site because it's not why they want to exist. They want people to be able to come together and connect with each other and have it be a pleasant experience and not see hate speech or death threats. So most of the big sites, you're going to find that the policies are fairly similar, and they don't allow most of the content that people would think of as appalling. Now, people will sometimes disagree about exactly where those lines should be, and we should talk about that. But the much harder part for companies is, how do you then find that content? And here's where understanding the chronology, we've talked a little bit about the legal chronology, understanding the tech chronology is also kind of interesting. I joined what was then Facebook in 2012. At that time, basically, the only way that the big apps, who are the best positioned to moderate content, the only way those big apps had to find violating content was by user reports, pretty much. I mean, they could do their own manual sweeps, but there was no magical tool that would go and find violating content. So all these apps had reporting flows where if you were using Facebook, you could click on a button and report the content, and it would come through to somebody who would look at it and make a decision. Over time, the companies started investing in proactive measures to go out and find that content. It started with the ability to find still imagery that was already known. And an example of that might be images of child sexual exploitation that the government knew about, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children could take those images, reduce them to a digital fingerprint, what we call it a hash, and then the companies could use software to find those known bad images when they were uploaded. That was where it started. If you fast forward and you look at where we are today, for the big apps, the vast majority of the content that they remove for violating their policies is content that they find proactively. So we publish, at Meta, we publish a transparency report quarterly where we walk through how much content did we remove in each of the areas. So, hate speech and impersonation and this and that. And you can see how much was removed, and then you can see how much of this did we find ourselves before anybody reported it to us. If you look at those numbers from when we started publishing the reports back in 2017 to where they are now, it's like, whoop. It's not perfect.
Is that because your technology improved?
It's because the technology has gotten better. And I don't know if we have any engineers in the room, but much like you can't just wish a scientific achievement into existence, with these tech tools, boy, I mean, there was a long time there where we were working as an industry saying, because these tech tools are often shared. Like Microsoft built the first photo DNA, which allowed us to identify the known images of child sexual exploitation. They licensed that tool for free to the industry. And then we were working as an industry to say, how can we do that for videos? It's so much harder. I know way more. I didn't study anything engineering-wise. I know way more about that topic than I should because we were so deeply involved in how can we make this work. And it was hard. But around 2017, you started to see the development of some of that technology. And now these big companies have these tools that have gotten to the point where, for Meta, the other companies publish a lot of this stuff too, but for Meta, if you look at our report, you'll see for things like, hate speech or, sexual exploitation, even adult sexual exploitation, something like, 95% of the content we're removing or even higher is stuff that we're finding ourselves. That is something that 230 allowed to happen, and it's something that we should keep in mind whenever we're hearing cases about, content that is left up that is really upsetting and awful. Is this that the company chose to allow this content? Did they have a policy of permitting it? Or was it just that their technology was not perfect and the user reporting system did not work for whatever reason? That's something where it's, when we think about regulatory motivations, we have to think about incentives. And if the companies have incentives already, for instance, let's take the issue of child sexual exploitation material. I don't think you're going to find a company out there that is going to want that content on their platforms. In any of these established apps, they don't want that content on their platforms. It's a horrible experience. It's not who they want to be. If there is an instance of that content on their platforms, how should regulators think about that? And that's a question I think we have to think about when we start thinking about, what are the right ways to regulate the internet?
What are the right ways to regulate the internet? You have a flexibility that is almost unequaled in this country. I mean, people who are critical of Section 230 say, well, the fairness doctrine limited the television networks for decades before anything. It was restrictive on the networks. They had to allow equal time for opposing views. It was an interference with the freedom of broadcasting. Some people say that the internet has too much freedom, that it needs regulation. It needs some. Section 230 was this gift that has never been looked at again. And careful, I'm obviously exaggerating the criticism, but what do you think about that?
I would encourage people to look at hoop earrings, not the right thing to wear with a mask. I'm just going to leave it dangling. I would encourage people to look at the data that companies publish about the prevalence of violating content on their sites. Look at the data. Because, and again, I'm not talking about illegal content. The companies, the larger and even medium-sized companies in this space all go well beyond what is illegal speech. And they remove things like content that would promote eating disorders or content that is constitutionally protected hate speech. If you look at the prevalence, you will see that, like, look at Meta's transparency report and look at the prevalence of things like hate speech or bullying. The prevalence, and what I mean by that is what percentage of views of content on Facebook or Instagram are of violating content. The prevalence is very small. And I'm talking it so small that for some categories it's actually hard for us to measure, because the way that we measure it is basically we set aside a statistically significant sample and we go through it with a fine-tooth comb and we see what did we miss. And the prevalence is sometimes hard to calculate because it's such a small percentage that statistically, that you can't extrapolate it very easily, but it's often less than 0.1%. So when we think about, and I've heard people say that about the internet. Is the internet a place that is somehow riskier
The
than
Wild West.
yeah, things like this. I would say look at what the data says, and of course there is speech that we don't want on our services, just like there is conduct in the real world that we don't want to happen. But look at the problem of risky content, risky speech, risky behavior in the real world in the broader context of your overall life or your overall experience on the internet or your overall experience on a certain app. And then I think it helps put it in perspective. The reality is the vast majority of people who are using Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and so forth are people that are coming to connect with family and friends and others who are interested in the things that they're interested in. The vast majority of content on these apps doesn't violate the policies and is certainly not illegal.
Well, I want to turn in a moment to the political situation, what might lie ahead in the very near future. But meanwhile, just one more case that is often brought up is of the Rohingya minority in Burma, Myanmar, and the notion that Facebook in particular tolerated, accepted, I don't know that the word encouraged would be right, but circulated information that contributed to the Burmese army's persecution of the Rohingya. You've heard of this one before, I'm sure.
We certainly never tolerated hate speech or any targeting of the Rohingya. In fact, I recall even back in probably 2016, there are some unique challenges with that language you may know about. Engineers might know about it. There's something unique about something about the rendering of that language and some challenges. We actually were printing pamphlets with the hate speech policies and putting them in internet cafes to make sure that people did understand the rules. Yeah, so and we were working with groups. Safety. We have a network of safety partners around the world, which we've had for a long time, and that includes groups in Southeast Asia and in Myanmar, where they can flag for us if there is a trend or something we can be aware of. They can also bring pieces of content to our attention. Now, I'm never going to say that any of these efforts are perfect. A lot of the value of social media sites and the social media experience is that you can experience things in real time. You don't post something on X and then wait for 3 days until it's been reviewed and is then published on X. Instead, it's a real-time experience, a real-time flow of information. And that means necessarily that when companies are moderating content, they have to use tools that are blunt and imperfect. And there are costs to false negatives, which is what we call it when content that violates a policy, let's say it's hate speech, it's not allowed on the site. There will be false negatives where something violates, but it is left up on the site because we missed it. There will also be false positives. And that means that by using tools that are imperfect to try to proactively find and remove violating content, we're going to catch some innocent content in that net as well. People often focus on the times that companies miss content. I think that is a question that, of course, we should be looking at that because content that violates policies, content that creates risks, you don't want to miss that content. And we work all the time to get better and better, and we've seen our tools get better and better. But we should also consider that removing content that doesn't violate policies has its own costs. And sometimes people think about this as safety versus free expression. I think that's an interesting lens, and I think that's an accurate description for some cases. And that might be something like you have, here's an example. When you're thinking about removing content about eating disorders or drug use or hate speech, often the content that is close to the line, so for a lot of companies, they'll draw the line at saying, you cannot promote self-harm, you cannot promote eating disorders, you cannot promote illegal drug use, but you can discuss your journey with an eating disorder, and you can discuss the recovery efforts that you have as you're trying to recover from your opioid addiction. That content that's close to the line is often the sort of content that's going to get caught by one of those proactive detection tools I was talking about earlier. And we see this. I have seen instances on all of the social media platforms where content that is counter speech against something harmful, or it's educational speech. It's speech that's designed to help people find opioid addiction treatment centers, ends up getting removed because companies are using these tools to try to be aggressive. There is another dynamic to this. So I talked about safety versus freedom of expression and the risk of removing innocent content. There's another dynamic, which is sometimes it's literally a safety versus safety kind of risk. If you leave up too much and some of it violates, let's take self-harm content, okay? If somebody, and we work with safety experts to make sure that we are drawing our policy lines in the best way to promote safety. And basically what safety experts tell us is, if somebody is encouraging others to harm themselves, you should remove that. If they are saying, I'm thinking of harming myself, I want to harm myself, you should leave that up, because that's often a cry for help, and you need to let people get support from family and friends. So here's a question. What do you do if somebody posts, I just cut my wrists again and it feels so good? Is that a cry for help? Is that encouraging others? A lot of the companies will tend to err on the side of removing that content, based on wanting to make sure they're not leaving up something that's harmful. But you're always asking yourself as well, am I causing harm if we remove content where somebody is crying out for help? These are just, they're very fraught issues. We tend to err on the side of removing content in that area, but it's one of those issues where you always have to ask yourself, it's not just about get more aggressive and take down, take down, take down. You also have to think, what am I removing that actually might be really important speech?
So it is widely assumed in the coverage leading up to this election that whoever wins is liable to take some sort of move to weaken Section 230 or advocate a regulatory regime that is tougher, or that is seen as a problem by social media. What do you think? And each side would do it for its own reasons. Each side claims that there's a bias against it on social media now.
It is impossible to discuss internet law without talking about the partisanship that has overtaken every policy discussion. Both sides want to dictate how the internet companies make their decisions because there's power that's being allocated in that process, and they want to direct that power towards them. The unfortunate consequence is that one of the few things that both parties can agree on is that they want to impose their will against the internet companies and to dictate how they're making their editorial procedures. That's unconstitutional. That's clearly not permitted, and yet both sides are addicted to it. So, for example, here in California, we would think that the California legislature would be a supporter of the internet and would be actively working to boost one of the most important economic segments of its market. And just in the last month or so, California lost 2 different First Amendment challenges to its laws that said that the California legislature had engaged in impermissible censorship that violated the First Amendment. So when you say that whoever wins the presidential election is going to be pushing for more internet regulation, that's a true statement, but it is not about the president. It's actually about every political level. Both sides are pushing to say, we think we can run the internet better than it's currently being run. And that is a risk that we all face. That's why we get things like the TikTok ban. Literally, let's just said, let's just cancel one of the players in the market. We're just going to knock them out of the market. We will only see more of that so long as the legislatures won't face consequences from the courts. Now, what happens with Section 230, I don't want to say is almost beside the point, but from my perspective, there's been less effort to reform Section 230 in Congress because Congress is working on other laws that would usurp the benefits that we get from Section 230 and engage in unconstitutional censorship of the internet. So we are in the fight for the internet's life today. And I know for some of you who came with a promotion, like, I love the internet. I use it every day. It's an integral part of my life. Of course, that's going to remain so. You should know that your legislatures are actively working against that goal, and you can't take anything that you currently have for granted. It is all in play, and that is, it won't matter who wins the presidency on that front.
So what will the strategy be of the major companies after the election? Let's look at both sides of it. I mean, it's very hard to know what former President Trump would do if he becomes President Trump again. And
he did try to to cancel Section 230.
Oh, I know.
He literally wrote an executive order saying repeal Section 230.
And
we know what he is likely to do.
This time around,
that was 2020.
Right, that's what I thought. So, but there's a little bit of, one could say, a bit of unpredictability about Donald Trump at the moment.
He could do even crazier things, that's true.
Right. But what would be the scenario? How would this happen, and how would the companies respond? I bet you've thought about it.
Surprise some people in the room, but for a lot of the big social media platforms, most of the people using their apps are outside the United States. And so we deal with regulations in different countries all the time. For Facebook and Instagram, roughly 90% of the people using those services are outside the US. So for as long as I've been at the company, we have been dealing with speech-related requests from, well, not requests, legal orders to take action based on the content on our services. And now in some places in the world, like in Europe with the Digital Services Act, in the UK, in Singapore, in Australia, in India, we're seeing regulations that are taking more broader and more systematic approaches to content regulation. And that has prompted, at Meta, and I'm sure at the other large companies, that has prompted basically efforts to build ways of providing the transparency, the accountability, responding to whatever regulations those regions come up with. In some places, we're seeing regulations that are requiring transparency, audits, reporting. And other places, it's more, if we tell you to do something on a certain piece of content, you need to do that. For instance, in Singapore, it's labeling certain content as misinformation if they tell you to. But that regulatory compliance function is now something that these bigger companies have all built.
And if Kamala Harris is elected president, what do you expect, Eric, in this domain?
it's a little less predictable how she would play it. We have small data points that we can explore if we need to. But my point being that what the president does is only a small fraction of the overall threats.
I think that's an important point.
Yeah, so from my perspective, it almost really doesn't matter what she does. The tide is so strong in favor of regulation here in the U.S. that she's not going to stand up to that tide. The only question is, will she try and accelerate it?
And just to go back a second, how do you explain this extreme hostility in some of the state legislatures?
So this is actually like a super interesting question, and for those of you in political science, like trying to figure out this feedback loop between the media, between politicians, and between constituents is super interesting. But basically, there was a switch in the media coverage of the internet, what I call, or we call, the techlash. That there's been this general evolution to think that where we used to be excited and respect internet services, now we think of them as threats. And politicians found political gold in positioning themselves as part of the techlash, so they then accelerate the media coverage of the problems with the internet, which then their constituents reward because they've been educated that there's threats and that the politicians are working on those threats. And so it becomes this kind of downward spiral in the conversation. And that's what's happened. So all of our politicians are politically rewarded for attacking the internet. And we as voters are rewarding them for that. Right? Remember, California legislature, our legislators who we have the power to vote for or against are actively working against the internet today, and we still vote them back in. And we don't tell them, hey, stop it, quit it. You're working against your constituents' interests. And so as long as they're rewarded, as long as they continue to get media attention, as long as the media attention keeps amplifying the political attacks, all we hear is the negative about the internet. When the internet started back in the 1990s, it became a part of the mass market, there was just fawning press coverage about the potential of the internet.
That's true.
And how great it was, and new things that people were doing that humans had never been able to do before. Try to think about the last time you read an article that talked about how great the internet is. And some of you probably have never read one of those in your lives. So, like, it's just, the media matters to us. The political payoffs matter to the politicians. And they're in this loop that they're locked into. And there's no way to overcome it without remembering why the internet is so important to us. And nobody is actually speaking on behalf of that.
So there are certain states where it seems particularly virulent. The move against TikTok, I can't remember now if it's Idaho or Utah.
There was a law in Montana, but I'm sorry, I am going to challenge the premise of that question. Every state is working against the internet now.
Every state.
Every state has got bills that are designed to diminish the functionality of the internet and to take power out of the hands of their constituents. And I cannot stress enough. We think, well, at least here in California, we're better than that. We are the leader in some circumstances of efforts to enact new censorship of the internet. So, if you're going to try and pit red states versus blue states or wealthy states versus poor states, or none of that matters.
Well, that makes the question easier. Why? Why is it so universal? What is it?
I think that goes back to my negative downward spiral loop that I was talking about.
Right.
Because politicians find political gold because the media keeps saying that the internet is bad and nobody is speaking up on behalf of the actual benefits of the internet. And that's true across all the states. It's across all the globe. You know this in all the countries that is working in. It's not just the U.S. Everyone is finding political gold and attacking the internet.
So, Monica, how do you interpret that? The two of you are certainly very articulate in fighting this, and there must be an army of people like you working for the companies or in law schools or in the tech industry generally who are making similar related points. Why is there this successful or this persistent political tide.
Monica, if you don't mind, just before, I'll just point out, so I don't know what the students' experience is like here. My son goes to Berkeley City College, and he's had several writing classes. And in each writing class, the assignment has been from the professors, here's a book, criticize the internet, critique this book. And so, like, the only material he's reading in school, the only thing he's learning about is all these critiques and problems of the internet. They never sign a book saying, here's the benefits of the internet, critique that book. So, like, it's so pervasive that you think, like, there are law students defending the internet. Yeah, there are a few, but they grew up in a system where they were taught from relatively early in their educational system that the internet is bad. That's the source material they're getting as part of their education. So, like, if anything, the digital natives are even a greater threat to the internet because that's how they were taught. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I do think that often when I go into conversations with people externally, there is misperception about the efforts that the companies are already engaged in. For instance, I can remember back during the height of ISIS, Islamic State, and for some of you, you may not remember that, but this was a moment that was really gripping across the world, where there was a lot of concern about the rise of this terror group and also their attempts to recruit foreign fighters. And I would have, meanwhile, behind the scenes, the industry was sharing best practices. There were technical tools that were being licensed. Every major company was trying to proactively look for and remove terror propaganda and support of these terror groups. But I would still have external conversations where people would say, you guys need to understand that this terror group is out there and that they are trying to use the internet. And so I do think there's more that we need to do as an industry to actually publicize what we're doing. For instance, how many people in here have heard of the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership? Okay, some people have. So the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership basically was a bunch of industry companies coming together and saying, what do we think industry standards should look like? And it's things like thinking about risks when you're designing the products, having policies that you write down that address those risks and being transparent about them, having an enforcement team and building tools to enforce those policies, publishing reports about how that's going. And that's something that I think is a very good, it's good evidence of how the industry incentives are often aligned with the incentives of the public and public servants who are really focused on safety issues and so forth. But I think we need to do more to sort of get that out there so people understand that those efforts are actually going on.
Questions and comments. We have a system where you can put your question in with the QR code, right? And then they will be read out.
Yeah, we have a list of questions here. This is from an anonymous user. Why does the role of human content moderators, not just users hitting the report button, always seem to disappear in these conversations around moderation?
Yes, please.
I love this question. So the reason I love this question is because I go and watch our content reviewers. We have teams all over the world who review content. The work they do is so impressive. They have to learn policies, but they also have to be able to apply that knowledge to the trends that are happening in a particular market. Remember earlier I said that for Facebook and Instagram, 90% of people using these apps are outside the United States? That means that when I go and watch our content reviewers in Bangkok, Thailand, as I have done, they are looking at content and they're telling me as I'm, watching them go through their what they're doing. They're like, yeah, so here's where we are noting trends that we are seeing right now in this language, because when people are talking about this thing, here's how they're talking about it. I mean, it is a very, constantly evolving thing to understand speech and the way that it is being used. So thank you to the person who asked the question for drawing attention to that.
if I can just add that certainly this is an issue that's personal to me. I worked with a team that included support from Meta to create an organization called the Trust and Safety Professional Association, the TSPA, which was designed to give a voice to the people who are doing the work in trust and safety so that they would not be invisible. So we have a lot of work left to do, obviously, but I want you to know that we have an organization working on that issue right now.
There was a notorious article in a magazine called Verge a couple of years ago about the lives of content moderators and how their working conditions were so bad and their emotional reactions to their work was so severe. Was that distorted? Has it improved since, if it was true then?
I can't speak to the article. I can tell you that my team and I, so my team is the content policy team. These are the people who, I'm simplifying here, but these are the people who are working to write the policy lines. They do that with input from internal and external research and data, and also with stakeholder input from experts around the world, and that's issue specific. So if we are looking at something around videos of violence to animals, and some people are worried about the graphic nature of that and hurting animals, and others are saying, no, this is the most important stuff to share so that we can highlight the plight of animals, we will go and find people on both sides of that issue in all regions around the world and sort of put that together. Then we give that guidance to our content reviewers and our technical teams who are building those blunt tools that go out and try to identify the violating content. And we work with them to make sure that those policies are being implemented. So my team and I work with the content moderators, the content reviewers personally. The content review sites, and I haven't been in all of them, but I've been in a number of them around the world, they look a lot like Meta offices. You know, they have your little snack kitchens and your workstations and everything. When people sort of make fun of the Silicon Valley offices, like, they look like Meta offices. One thing I love is talking to the content reviewers and hearing their experiences and the expertise that they've developed, because they understand that what they are doing is contributing to making the internet safer. Look, there's policy violations that we have that aren't safety related. Some of it's just about making sure people are having the experience they want to have. But there's also some real harms that we have to be attuned to. Images of child sexual exploitation is an example. Terror recruitment is another. When you talk to these content reviewers, you definitely get the sense that there is a level of pride that they have in knowing that what they are doing is so important.
I would just like to add that if there is a psychological and emotional toll of doing content review work, and that's a good reason to try to automate some of that work so that it's not borne by individual people. And yet, there are efforts by our regulators to take away the ability to automate some of the work that we're describing, or create legal disincentives to doing so. And so it's just the weirdest thing that the legislators who are saying we want to make the internet safer might actually be putting more people in the role of having to absorb these psychological and emotional burdens.
I love that you flagged that. There are certain tools that we developed even before the technology was good enough to go out and try to proactively find stuff. Back in 2013, 2014, when I was pretty new at the company, we were working on tools that could deal with the most graphic content so that people wouldn't have to. And the tools have gotten better and better and better. Sometimes we'll hear people say, yes, but if the tools aren't perfect, you should be sending everything to people. The reality is that people aren't perfect either. That we try to use machines for what the machines are good at and use people for what the people are good at, but none of this is going to be perfect. But I agree, where we can use technology, it not only is a faster and more scaled experience, but it's also better.
Other questions?
I'm going to merge two questions. The first part is, how does Section 230 intersect with the recent flurry of kids' online safety laws enacted here in California and other states? And if the question is violation of guidelines, how are companies and institutions working with the government to facilitate accountability?
Since basically the beginning of internet law, there has been efforts to, quote, protect children online. I mentioned the Communications Decency Act. That was a child protection measure that also had this payload of Section 230 for reasons that relate to the weird administrative navigation that got us there. And there's so many problems with talking about protecting children online that we just assume away because we want to make sure that children are safe. But some children have different needs than others. Sometimes they are actually in opposition to each other. And in some cases, the interventions that are required would actually put children at greater risk, not less. So, for example, one of the common go-to parts of a child safety measure is to segregate adults from children online. And the way in which you do that requires people to do things like provide government documentation or to show their face, both of which have significant privacy and security risks that actually you might not want children to be trying to navigate around. And so when we hear child safety online, our initial instincts are, well, we want more of that. But the solutions are actually really hard to obtain. And usually the goal is not to protect children. The goal is actually to create more censorship, to control how people are talking to each other online. And if that's the case, actually these laws are in deep tension with Section 230 because their goal is to take away conversations that are taking place, to keep children from contributing to them, to keep children from consuming them, and to hope that the tools actually extend to even restricting adult-to-adult conversation. Those are usually the goal, not an incidental byproduct of the legislation. And all of those are in tension with what Section 230 enables, which is allowing websites allowing users to talk to each other. So I encourage you, when you see efforts to protect children online, ask some more questions about that. But don't start with the presumption that those laws are being tendered in good faith, and don't assume that they will actually only benefit children with no impact on adults, because the outcome is almost certainly going to be the opposite.
Yes. How are companies and institutions working with the government to facilitate accountability when it comes to violation of guidelines?
So depending on where you are in the world, sometimes there are regulations that require us to respond to specific government orders or implement certain things, for instance, labels in Singapore, example I gave earlier, based on regulations that have been passed. In other places, the requirements are more around transparency. So producing reports that show how you were doing at certain areas of content policy, or making certain information available to auditors. I think all the big companies are now basically engaged in a variety of those different things. One thing that might be interesting for people is that the way that governments interact with companies, it can be very different based on the nature of the government and their concerns and the way that government functions. So, for instance, and if you look online, you'll find stories about this. Some of the companies deal with illegal speech orders that have to do with political speech. So you might have a government where criticizing the government is against the law, and the companies will get takedown orders saying you must remove this content because it criticizes the president or criticizes the president's son. What most of the companies do in a situation like that is they sometimes have to say, okay, well, we're being asked to remove this content. They'll try to remove the content, but they'll make it visible or invisible only in that country, and they'll arrange it so that other people can still see it. And then they'll try to report, this goes to the accountability part of this question, you got to be sometimes accountable to the government, but also you want to be accountable to the public as well. So often companies will then report on the content that they have taken down in response to government regulatory orders.
Other questions? We have time for, I think, one or two more questions, John.
Sure. How does Section 230 intersect with the recent flurry of kids' online safety laws enacted here in California and other states?
We just
sorry.
did that.
Sorry, I meant to read the other one out. Can you speak to elected officials drafting legislation on censorship and AI, as well as tech companies that supported their campaigns?
I'll take the bait. We're having another moment, just like we had with the development of the internet, with respect to AI, and we're seeing new tools enable human behavior that we've never been able to see before, much of which is positive, some of which is not, just like the internet. And the response from regulators has been universally paranoia and fear about this, and they are doing everything in their power to restrict, hobble, or otherwise extinguish the tools that we might use that under this category called generative AI. And the battle is going to turn on whether or not generative AI outputs qualify for First Amendment protection. If they do, almost everything that's been passed and proposed is unconstitutional. If the Constitution does not protect generative AI outputs, then everything that the legislatures are doing will be permitted and will also be an existential threat to the industry. So there's a huge fork in the road question that nobody is quite ready to answer, and ultimately will require a Supreme Court to answer. And until we know that, we're just flying a little bit blind about whether or not the laws that are being passed actually will do what they purport to do.
I think class time has ended when some of the people were here, and I think you guys have been very patient. I hope you're feeling all right, Monica.
Yeah, it's been good for my health.
Good. So thank you both very much for this enlightening discussion.
Thank you.